Okay, let's start, I think. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the time zone that you're joining from. I'm Benu Verma. I'm an associate scientist with International Rice Research Institute, and I work with the evidence module. For those of you who might be unfamiliar, CGIAR is a consortium of international organizations working for research on agriculture. We are 14 organizations right now in this consortium. The CGIAR Gender Impact Platform, where gender stands for generating evidence and new directions for equitable results, is committed to synthesizing and amplifying research, building capacities, setting directions to enable CGIAR to have maximum impact on gender equality, opportunities for youth, and social inclusion in agri-food systems. It strengthens gender and social science research by providing the highest standards and setting strategic directions for current and future research endeavors. This guidance enables CGIAR and its partners to conduct cutting-edge research and develop and scale innovations. CGIAR's Gender Impact Platform was launched in 2020, but in view of and to support the mega programs 2030 of CGIAR, this platform is undergoing some transition, and it will basically mean that it is expanding its work on youth and socially excluded groups. The platform organizes its work through 3 interlinked modules: evidence, methods, and alliances. The evidence module, which is led by Dr. Ranjita Puskar of International Rice Research Institute, is designed to focus on synthesizing and sharing robust evidence, identifying and closing evidence gaps in the areas of gender and youth in agri-food systems. The module aims to use research-generated evidence around key themes to develop solutions and pathways to reduce inequalities within the dynamics of a changing food system. It aims to improve the quantity and quality of evidence on topics of global interest to promote the development of scalable technologies and strategies. The module is positioned to foster partnerships among researchers, academicians, development partners, private sector, and think tanks to leverage the evidence of equitable and sustainable food systems. In the recent years, collective action has emerged as an integral institutional approach to improve the socioeconomic conditions of small-scale farmers, especially women. It is considered that collectivity helps in influencing efficiency in delivery of inputs and training, accessing economies of scale, and increasing bargaining power that otherwise is difficult to achieve on individual levels. Because of its effectiveness, collective action has become one of the key entry points for rural livelihood interventions across agri-food systems, especially for women's groups and collectives. Now, collective action is supposed to address systematic and structural barriers that women face, like the lack of land ownership and other reproductive and productive assets. And it has been linked to better economic and socio-cultural indicators like monetary benefits because of better yield and better marketing techniques, improved skills and capacities due to knowledge sharing, better access to credit, market information and use of improved technology, reduction in care burden and experience of time poverty, better mobility and change in social norms, restricting market access, increased political awareness around their rights and entitlements, and increased participation in the local self-governance of the infrastructure. So we thought as the evidence module that if we could indeed produce evidence for this particular interlinkage between women's collective action and their resilience getting built, and with all these indicators coming up in a solid way, we could put an impetus on more investment in collective action strategies for women, as well as encourage more nuanced research on this particular interlinkage and encourage the researchers to look into this interlinkage, which is yielding supposedly very good results. And so by the way of testing out this particular narrative or hypothesis and to analyze the quality of evidence that existed out there on this particular linkage, as well as to test its tenacity, back in 2024, we floated an RFP, and the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, were selected to lead this review from a competitive bid that responded to terms of reference published by IRRI. IIED's team, which worked on this particular research, had thematic experts from agri-food systems, gender justice, and systematic review. Now, as soon as we were in research, as soon as we had started, we had figured out that a rapid review would be a good format for this particular research. even though we wanted our evidence to be as robust as possible, we couldn't engage in a systematic review. And that is because a rapid review gave us the flexibility of snowballing from one reference to the other, and also dig deep into the gray literature, where indeed most of the evidence regarding this particular interlinkage lied. And then moving on, we had the challenge of defining the terms that we were dealing with in our question. Our question was women's collective action and resilience in agri-food systems. But what do we mean by collective action? Who sees collective action as collective action? Just by enrolling yourself in a group, does that mean that you're engaged in collective action? So on and so forth. I remember also having a dilemma around what kind of stressors are we looking at? Are these stressors only climate change? Or are they also economic or health related or disaster related stressors? And then I think something which most gender researchers here in the audience would relate to, we were quite stuck on the term resilience. What does resilience even mean? What is it to say that this is resilience? And how is it different from, say, empowerment and agency? Again, two of the most well-used terms in literature on gender research. And there is indeed a lot of slipperiness in the connotations of these three particular terms. And they're often used interchangeably. And arguably, they could be, there could be three different points in the trajectory of self-growth or a growth of a community. But at the same time, they do not mean the same thing, so they are distinct, to say the least. And more so because as we, encountered, and IIED will share examples of this as well, I believe. The studies that we encountered also spoke about negative resilience, which is something that empowerment and agency would probably never have a connotation of negativity. And so, for example, if a woman is skipping meals in order to keep intact the household security and so that everybody else in the household is still able to have meals, then this is externally looked at as a symbol of resilience, because even in times of food shortage, the household is eating well. The children and the men of the house are eating well, but the woman is skipping her meals. So this is an example of negative resilience. And so with many such, after many such brainstorming sessions, we finally have this wonderful working paper with us, that we are going to discuss with you today. This research has built on existing evidence related to covariate shocks. That's something that we finally concluded with. Expanding the scope of inquiry to include different types of shocks and stress, as well as a range of women's group types. Also, it adopted an intersectional lens, keeping in mind that intragender dynamics can be as nuanced as intergender dynamics. However, limitations around the availability of disaggregated data did remain a challenge. This review will contribute to knowledge gaps about women's collective action and resilience in agri-food systems, and provide useful insights for practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. Now, before I hand over this presentation to IIED team, I would request Janine, if you could, there's some housekeeping instructions that I'd like to give. Firstly, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section of the webinar or in the chat box. And while you're doing that, please let us know your name, organization, and what part of the world you're joining from. And please help us prioritize Q&A by upvoting questions, by clicking on a thumbs up to upvote a question that might resonate with your thoughts that are already there. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Janine from IIED. Thank you.
Okay. Janine's just going to swap her presentations, and we'll bring up the presentation that we'll speak to today. But just while she does that, thank you, Banu, for introducing us so well there. So for the remainder of the hour, you'll hear from each of the researchers involved in this project here at IIED. There were 5 of us that have contributed, and we'll share with you some of the insights, some of the key findings from the research. But as ever, the detail is in the research report, so we do encourage you to go to the research report when it's available in the coming months. And just whilst we're waiting for Janine to share the screen, just a note too, please do use the Q&A as we go along. We will be able to, because there's 5 of us, we'll be able to respond to questions of clarification, and then we can save those thematic questions for our discussion later on. Janine, can you move on the slide, please? Perfect. So as we began this review jointly with IRRI, we started to elaborate our key research question. And we came to this research question here, which is in pink, which is about what are the differential impacts of women's collective action on their resilience to climate, environmental, economic, health, and/or political shocks and stresses in the context of agri-food systems in low or middle income countries. Before we get into the findings, we wanted to emphasize the boundaries of that question. So by collective action, we mean any formal or informal women-led or majority women group working together in pursuit of a shared interest. We were interested in differential impacts, so we adopted an intersectional lens. And that's recognizing, as we all know, that women are not one homogenous group. We're inclusive of all local communities, and so collective action, whether it was in a rural to an urban paradigm. And we were interested in collective action at any stage along the value chain up until the point of consumption. As it says in our research question, we were interested in the context of environmental, including climate, health, political and/or economic change that creates a stress, a shock, or a combination of shocks and stresses. And we were inclusive of any change to women's resilience capacities. And we're understanding resilience here as the ability of women to anticipate, to absorb, to mitigate, to adapt, to recover, to transform following a shock or a stress or a combination of shocks or stresses in a manner that reduces their chronic vulnerability. Next slide, please, Janine. So really briefly, what we did for this rapid evidence review, as far as possible, we followed well-known standards and guidelines on how to undertake a rapid evidence review, such as those from the Cochrane and the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And this included applying search strings to academic and grey literature. We also snowballed on from relevant literature that we found, relevant publications that we found. When we applied our search strings, we got a huge body of literature. And then to find those studies that answered our researcher question, we applied eligibility criteria consistently across each publication, across each study. And examples of those for this study includes, for example, study design. So for this evidence review, we were inclusive of any research publication that incorporated primary data. But for the evidence review, because we're looking for evidence, we weren't interested in opinion pieces or blogs or other literature reviews. We only included studies that really clearly detailed their gender composition of the collective action. So we really could be sure that we were interrogating women's collective action specifically, and only studies which analyze the impacts of collective action on women's resilience within the context of a clearly stated shock or stress or combination of shocks and stresses. All the studies then that were then included following this eligibility criteria screen then went on through a process that we call critical appraisal. And that's where we ask each individual study, we have a look and we think, is this study clear on what it seeks to do? Is the data sufficiently rigorous? Or the data analysis rather sufficiently rigorous? Are the findings convincing, taking into account the methodology and the research question? And all that process helps us do is to understand our confidence in the evidence base as a whole. And then as we go on to present these results, you'll see that we've arranged them according to a process of inductive thematic analysis. And that's where key themes emerge from the evidence itself. And then we categorize these findings according to whether they're positive, mixed, neutral, or negative, whether they had what impacts they had on women's resilience. And so with all that in mind, I think we're now well prepared to move to the findings. So Isabella, over to you to set us off on that track.
Thanks, Francesca. So now onto the coverage of the studies that passed that eligibility criteria that Francesca just mentioned. In terms of the geographic scope, the 33 studies that were included in our review covered 27 lower and middle income countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But almost half of those focused on East Africa, with Kenya being the most studied country. And the second most studied region was West Africa, covered by 24% of the studies. The studies focused predominantly in rural settings and mostly in the context of agriculture and livestock rearing. The evidence we capture is heavily skewed towards savings groups, which for the purposes of this review, we have used as a category to include the many variations that are across regions. So this category includes village savings and loans associations, self-help groups, savings and internal lending committees, and many other of this specific type of group where women come together to save and fund loans and generate interest on those savings as well. Only 9% of the studies, which is 3, focus on cooperatives, and this was agricultural cooperatives specifically. And 33 of the studies did not provide enough detail on the type of collective action that we were able to categorize it. So it was often referred only as women's group or women's collective without giving any more detail about it. In terms of the gender composition of these groups, most of the studies, that was 80% of the studies, primarily focused on women-only groups or women majority, and only 6 papers focused on mixed groups, but provided gender disaggregated data for the impacts on resilience. Lastly, most of the studies focused on environmental shocks or stress, such as droughts, then 9 only on health shocks such as COVID or Ebola pandemics, and 7 on economic shocks such as specific policy reforms. And finally, 5 on political stress such as conflict, for example. And I think I'm going to hand over to Julia now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Isabella. So resilience is obviously at the heart of this study, but just a quick little exercise that we thought we would run before kind of delving into some of the issues around resilience in the review. So we're going to invite you to go to menti.com. Some of you might be familiar with this site. There's a link that should appear in the chat, which should take you to it directly, or you can go to menti.com and enter that code. But we're interested in kind of hearing from you, what's the first word that you think of when you hear resilience? What do you associate resilience with? And it'll become clear in just a second why we're interested in hearing what you think of when you hear resilience. So I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to get going on that, and then we'll move to the next slide. Okay, well, maybe we could move on to the next slide for now, and then we can come back and see what people come up with. Appreciate it might take a... Oh, there were quite a few. Sorry, my screen hadn't refreshed. Okay, well, great to see coping right in the middle there, because I think that's going to link into what we found as well. So yeah, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So yeah, as you'll be able to see from the results of that quick little exercise, there are quite a lot of different ways of defining resilience, sort of much debated issue within the literature. Within our study, that was kind of reflected in the fact that although 28 out of 33 studies do use that term, no 2 studies cited the same source. At the same time, most studies did kind of focus on that idea of coping with shocks and stresses and kind of recovering. And yeah, we sort of looked at kind of whether studies thinking about this idea of resilience in terms of the 3 A's sort of referenced at the bottom there. So absorptive, anticipatory, adaptive capacity, as well as transformative capacity. Thinking about it in that context, most studies focused on the sort of shorter term coping mechanisms, so absorptive capacity. So that's just a quick insight into defining the challenges of defining resilience in the review. But I'll hand it over to, is it Francesca next?
That's me.
Oh, Janine, sorry.
No worries. Great. So before we delve into the detail on our findings, I'll give you a quick overview of the results first. So as Francesca highlighted in her introduction, we conducted an inductive thematic analysis to examine the findings, and we categorized these findings based on whether collective action had a positive, negative, neutral, or mixed impact on women's resilience. However, none of the studies we analysed reported negative impacts, so that's why this category is not shown on the slide here. Our analysis identified 6 key themes, which we can see visualised in this bar chart. And as you'll see across those themes, the majority of the findings indicated that collective action had a positive impact on women's resilience, so shown in pink, with fewer studies reporting mixed impacts, shown in orange, or neutral impacts, shown in green. Neutral impacts refer to when cases of collective actions had no measurable impact on women's resilience. The most commonly reported theme was access to finance, which is perhaps not surprising given that the focus of self-help groups in the studies that we examined. This theme encompasses findings on how collective action impacts financial access, whether through increased savings or better access to credit. We further categorized these findings on how women reported using this finance, either to support household and food costs or to diversify and strengthen their livelihoods. The next 2 themes explore knowledge sharing and skills training, as well as peer support and resource sharing. These themes examine how the networks created through collective action can impact learning and mutual support. Our 5th theme examines how collective action can impact women's empowerment for resilience outcomes, while the final theme looks at the resilience of the collective action groups themselves, an important factor in sustaining resilience outcomes for women long term. We'll now move on to examine a few of the findings in a bit more detail. So given that most of the papers reported findings under the access to finance theme, this is where we'll begin. As we highlighted, most of the papers under this theme reported how collective action increased women's access to finance, and this in turn had a positive impact on women's resilience during a shock or a stress. 12 of the studies reported how women's food security increased as a result of better access to finance. The women reported using this finance to purchase food during times of food insecurity, for example, following a drought, extreme rainfall, or armed conflict, or to purchase seed and fertilizer to improve food production during challenging seasons, or to collectively purchase grain to store and use later during a stress or shock event. 10 of the studies also reported how finance was used to diversify and enhance women's livelihoods, which had a positive impact on their resilience. For example, by decreasing their reliance on a single source of income. Women reported using finance to make investments in livelihood opportunities previously not accessible due to initial high capital costs. Other examples highlighted how women's groups collectively rented land and cultivated agroforestry systems to diversify their income. And women organised into federations of self-help groups to aggregate their financial power to leverage capital and promote their small businesses. Key to these benefits was a reduced reliance on high-interest money lenders, which often required the women to provide collateral against their loans, and the prevention of asset sales to cope with a shock or a stress event. However, some of the studies also highlighted some risks or challenges under this theme. For example, in relation to livelihood diversification, one study found that women who used the loans to invest in existing livelihoods as opposed to diversifying saw less benefits. However, the women from the same study reported that the loans provided were often too small to diversify their incomes. Additionally, several papers highlighted challenges relating to the sustainability of finance provided through collective action. For example, while low or zero interest loans with flexible repayments improve women's access to finance, these beneficial loan terms can threaten the growth of the group or its future lending capacity as less money is being injected into the group funds. Similarly, other authors cautioned how severe or prolonged crises can deplete group savings, particularly if the whole community is impacted by the same shock or stress. Again, this can threaten future lending capacity of the group. Moving on to our next theme, 11 papers reported how the networks created through collective action promoted knowledge sharing between women and connected them to skills training, which improved their resilience to shocks and stresses. Again, under this theme, we saw positive contributions to food security as women shared strategies and received training that increased their knowledge on climate resilient agriculture. For example, women reported how they shared information to collectively identify and cultivate seeds and crops that were better able to cope with extreme conditions, such as heat or drought. External trainings were also shown to play a key role. Examples included how access to training and advisory services provided information and knowledge on drought risk reduction, adaptive and diversified agricultural practices, and environmentally friendly business development. The networks created through collective action groups were also reported to act as communication channels, increasing access to new knowledge and environmental risks and emergency information. One study highlighted how early warning and response systems based on Indigenous knowledge also help group members to better sustain their livelihoods and food security. These networks often acted as a space for members to voice and discuss problems and brainstorm solutions to issues such as climate change. As a result of targeted training and resource pooling, one study reported how agricultural cooperatives were better able to manage climate mitigation risk and reduce time poverty. For example, they were able to collectively construct channels to prevent erosion during heavy rains without significantly increasing their individual time commitments. While none of the papers included in our study highlighted key risks or challenges under this theme, in our discussion section, we highlight how studies lack detail on the longevity of benefits linked to external trainings, and whether these benefits were able to increase institutional capacities of the groups, or were tied mainly to individual members whose knowledge might be lost if they exited in the future. Our next theme examined how collective action promoted peer support and resource sharing, with 5 of the 6 studies reporting positive benefits for women's resilience. Several of the studies highlighted how collective action groups increase social cohesion between the women, strengthening mutual aid and solidarity. For example, one paper reported that in comparison to non-members, members of self-help groups were more inclined to help one another during times of stress. Another paper highlighted how members often rallied around those experiencing hardships, operating like an informal safety net. For example, one member experienced health-related shocks. Other group members offered emotional support and financial assistance to help cover medical fees. The authors additionally documented that members would cover the weekly savings contributions of those experiencing challenges to ensure the continuity of their group membership. One study reported how some groups were also shown to extend their support to non-members, strengthening the wider community's ability to support one another during times of crisis. For example, self-help groups from this study described offering support to displaced families who were non-members fleeing armed conflict. Members provided these families with food and cash taken from their group funds and helped to source temporary accommodation. Other studies highlighted how groups established seed banks and rice savings schemes to collectively store food to be used during a shock or stress event, such as crop failure caused by drought. While most of the papers reported positive impacts for women's resilience, one paper highlighted that although cooperatives were able to improve social cohesion, some community members did raise concerns that cooperatives may exacerbate existing inequalities between members and non-members and disrupt community harmony. There were also suggestions that non-members felt envious towards cooperative members. This is because members tended to have higher incomes due to improved agricultural production and had better access to resources, market information, and collective bargaining power. Moving on to our 5th theme, several papers reported that collective action helps to improve women's empowerment through improved self-confidence, agency, and increased advocacy for their rights. For example, members of collectives in Nepal, the majority of whom were low-caste urban poor, reported increased individual and collective empowerment. Prior to joining the groups, they highlighted feeling voiceless. However, participation in these collectives was described as boosting their confidence, enabling them to engage more actively with local authorities and advocate for their needs. However, there were also several constraining factors which limited the success of the women's collectives. For example, some government members refused to meet with the collectives because of their affiliations to different political or religious groups. Additionally, gender discrimination remained a significant obstacle for the group. Unless accompanied by a man, many government representatives refused to meet with members of the women collectives. Another member highlighted a significant increase in women's empowerment among self-help group members compared to non-members. For example, women members reported having more influence over household and business decision-making, increased control over food expenses, and increased influence on educational expenses. Interestingly, though, these changes were only demonstrated in communities not experiencing drought. For the communities that were experiencing drought, the authors found that women members reported a decline in influence over household decision-making. And finally, 4 studies examined the resilience of the collective action group themselves, all posing important questions and echoing discussions from the Access to Finance section about savings depletion and sustainability of finance. Overall, 3 of the studies reported how self-help groups were able to continue lending during crises events, such as extreme rainfall shocks and COVID-19. One study found that not only were self-help groups able to continue lending during and after the shock, but that there was also evidence to suggest that some members could borrow higher than average amounts during the shocks, and that defaulting on loans was rare. Another example reported how, despite facing financial and livelihood challenges during COVID-19, 60% of the VSLA groups in their study maintained group savings. However, many did so at a reduced level, raising questions about the sustainability of future lending. A final study highlighted challenges linked to externally funded groups and large-scale crises or compounded crises. This study examined the combined impacts of Ebola, COVID-19, and civil war on women's groups and collective farming in Sierra Leone. The authors described how the Ebola outbreak disrupted group operations as donor funding was redirected from income-generating activities to disease prevention, shifting funds away from the women's groups. The crisis also placed a disproportionate burden on women as caregivers, while government restrictions on market, trade, and public gatherings further strained their livelihoods and isolated them from communal support networks. These compounded shocks fragmented the groups, weakening their cohesion and long-term strategy, leaving them more reliant on external funding for group activities. I'm now going to pass on to Kata, who's going to review some of our evidence gaps.
Thanks, Janine. Yes, I would like to share our reflections on the limitations of the evidence we reviewed, as well as the resulting implications for future research and practice. So in general, while significant investments are being made to promote women's collective action, we found still limited evidence of its effects on women's resilience following a shock or a stress. Only 5 studies of the 33 in our review addressed the research question directly. And so this in itself reflects a general lack of inquiry into women's specific experiences of collective action and its influence on their resilience, specifically in the context of agri-food systems. I would like to note here, however, that our research our search for eligible studies for the review was conducted in the English language only, and so this might explain important regional gaps in the evidence we captured. The second point is that most studies didn't look at the unique barriers faced by certain women. they didn't break down data by factors like ethnicity, age, or economic status. And this is important because not all women benefit equally from collective action. Some may find it harder to access these benefits due to their individual characteristics. So the lack of this analysis limited also our ability to see which groups of women may benefit more or less, or how, from collective action. We also note that the description of women's collective action itself was relatively limited in many of the studies. So this made it challenging to understand the detailed nature of them and in turn to analyze their impact on resilience. And we also found that the existing evidence is mostly about certain types of collective action, as mentioned by my colleagues earlier, namely focused on savings groups. So over half of the 33 studies focused on these groups. And this may be because they are popular worldwide and often used as models for development efforts. But we also know that in order to understand resilience, we need to extend our view beyond financial health indicators. So exploring different types of collective action beyond savings groups could give us a better understanding of how it helps women's resilience in various situations. However, we need to also note here that the scope of our review and our eligibility criteria, including the need for studies to examine resilience in the context of a specific shock or stress, may have excluded certain studies that looked at other types of women's collective action. And just a few words on possible interactions of benefits, as well as factors that may moderate the resilience benefits of collective action. Several of the studies we reviewed show that women's collective action may provide benefits and services that may work in tandem with one another. So, for example, better access to finance helps women smoothen the impacts of shock or stress, as well as diversify their livelihoods, potentially further contributing to increasing their resilience. However, we also found mixed evidence of how these benefits may affect other coping strategies. And we conclude that more research is indeed needed to fully understand these complex interactions. The evidence we gathered also suggests that various moderating factors can influence how collective action impacts on women's resilience. But the studies we reviewed didn't always focus on these factors intentionally, so our insights here are also limited. We found, however, some evidence of key moderating factors, including the group's maturity and size, why the group was formed, the intensity of the challenges they faced, as well as the political and cultural context they operate in. So in summary, interactions and moderating factors complicate any effort in measuring the impacts of women's collective action on their resilience. And we also need to highlight a gap in the evidence about the types and severity of shocks and stresses that collective action may help women withstand. The intensity and nature of these challenges, of course, influence their long-term impact and the effectiveness of resilience-building efforts. But the studies we reviewed did not provide detailed descriptions of these shocks and stresses, whether they affected the whole communities or just individuals or individual households, or if they were ongoing or sudden. Additionally, few studies looked at how multiple shocks or stresses may interact and how these combined effects might influence the impact of women's collective action on their resilience. Julia has already mentioned the challenges we encountered during our review related to the definitions and measuring of resilience in the reviewed studies. And these challenges limit our insights on how collective action affects women's resilience that goes beyond short-term coping mechanisms and extend to systemic changes that reduce women's vulnerabilities, empower women, and positively contribute to their long-term resilience. Next slide, please. Thank you. So based on the evidence we found, we would like to offer the following recommendations for future research and practice. Firstly, we need to identify best practices and innovations in supporting collective action while considering the specific circumstances of marginalized groups within the community. So this means understanding the specific needs of different communities and making sure that collective action doesn't harm their natural resilience. Second, we need to understand how collective action helps build resilience in a wider sense. So researchers, practitioners, community leaders should work together to see how collective action helps people adapt, anticipate, and transform in the face of challenges. And it's also important to consider here the trade-offs and personal aspects of resilience, like self-confidence, risk-taking, etc. Third, we need more detailed, more granular data on how collective action impacts women's resilience. And this includes looking at specific actions and behaviors that help women become more resilient. Fourth, future research should consider factors like age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. This will help us understand how these factors affect women's access and benefits from collective action, leading to different outcomes for their resilience. Fifth, we need to understand what makes collective action sustainable, especially in savings groups. And this involves also looking at how different challenges and factors interact and affect women's collective action. Sixth, we should explore different types of collective action beyond savings groups. Studying various forms of collective action will give us a better understanding of how it helps women's resilience in different situations. And finally, it's important that women involved in collective action have access to the data and evidence from research and practice. So this information will help them understand resilience and the different experiences of building resilience for themselves, their families, but also their groups and their communities. Providing this information in easy to understand formats will give women valuable insights to improve their efforts and their advocacy. So this is where I would like to stop and pass the word to Francesca to moderate our question and answer sessions.
Yeah, thanks so much so far for all the questions that are coming in. I'm going to just delve right in there. The first question for the team, and I'm looking at Julia and Isabella, if you're happy to respond to this one, is, did you explore how women themselves define collective power and define resilience? So maybe Isabella, you could talk about it from a collective power, and then Julia, you could talk about it from the resilience perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Francesca. Yes, I think in relation to that question, since we were basing our definition of collective action, and also in terms of what the authors were, the way they were defining collective action, I don't think we could say if they use the definitions of women themselves. Like I said earlier as well, a lot of the studies didn't even provide that much detail on how they were defining collective action in the first place, which leaves a bit of an evidence gap, as well as Kata has mentioned before. But maybe we can, I don't know if Julia, you want to come in terms of talking about resilience.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, as others have said, we were looking at resilience specifically in the context, that definition of resilience in the context of a shock or stress led to this quite small pool of studies. And there wasn't a whole lot written about the indicators that the authors of these studies actually used to measure resilience. But it was, from those that kind of disclosed that information and discussed it, it was a mix of subjective and objective indicators. And we appreciate that there's quite a lot of academic debate about how best to sort of define and measure resilience. And there is a trend towards kind of using more subjective indicators, so things like self-reporting, whether people feel that they've been able to cope better with shocks and stresses due to things like, being part of a group. So I think there were sort of maybe 3 studies that used those kind of self-reporting indicators, but actually one of the main indicators that studies used was food security. So looking at whether being part of a group following a shock or stress allowed them to cope better with kind of hunger and food insecurity. So yeah, maybe just some quick insights there, but yeah, it's a super complex issue as well. And I see there's a question about holism, and that's something that we reflect on as well in the review, this trend towards kind of more holistic definitions of resilience.
Thank you, Julia and Isabella. So then on to our next question. And Janine, if I can invite you to respond to this one. So this is from Ruchi, and she said, they say in some of the studies on women's collectives, ActionAid has done in South Asia, they found that collectives that are more holistic, for example, looking at women's unpaid care, gender-based violence, and not only a collective around an economic activity, that these were more empowering, more resilient. And did we look into that aspect as part of our evidence review?
Yeah, thank you. Such a great question. I'd say that we don't have strong data from our review that speaks to that, but it's one of the things that we flagged, that in the literature there does tend to be an overemphasis on the economic aspects, specifically around self-help groups, and it's important to explore other benefits. And as we've highlighted, we kind of framed our findings around what was coming out of the literature. So we were led by what was in there. And unfortunately, we found that there was less emphasis on a more holistic approach to understanding the various benefits that can come through collective action, as opposed to just access to finance. So as you'll see in our recommendations, that's one of the things that we think future research and also practitioners need to be much more aware of when they're thinking about the resilience benefits for collective action.
Thanks, Janine. So then we have a question from Disha, which is about, did we find any stark differences in the impacts of collective action across the geographies? And maybe I can have a crack at this, Janine, and you can chip in. I think the key thing to say here is that we only found 33 studies, and most of them were from an East African context. And so actually we can't really look at in much detail any difference in patterns between different regions. And in fact, we do have a big gap in Central and South America, which I think is really important to be open and honest about. So I don't really think we did see any stark differences. We did see some corroboration, particularly around that access to finance findings, but I wouldn't say we would be able to pull out any stark differences just because of the limitations in the amount of evidence. Janine, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think you'd summarize it pretty well. I'd just say, yeah, a lack of evidence going into the detail unfortunately prevented us from that type of comparative analysis.
Fantastic. And then another question here from Vijesh about the impacts of collective in these studies were captured through perceptions and qualitative data, or quantitative and econometric analysis, avoiding selection bias. So really good question. I'll try to take this one on for myself. So if I just look at my notes, we had 33 studies, 27 of them used an observational approach. 4 of them used a quasi-experimental approach. And quite interestingly, though one of those that used a quasi-experimental approach was the one who kind of found no impact. And so actually those studies that are fueling this kind of positive impact were typically those qualitative studies. So it's quite interesting. There's not really much diversity in the different approaches that we saw across this evidence base. And actually, when we look at our critical appraisal results, when we looked at the quality of the different studies, it was very tricky to make a good judgment because often the information wasn't there. We couldn't necessarily always tell whether the data analysis, the data collection was rigorous. One thing over those 33 studies, that 13 of them met the 5 to 6 critical appraisal criteria, 8 met 3 to 4, and 12 met only 0 to 2. So not many of our critical appraisal criteria. So that gives us key questions here about the different forms of bias that we might see across the evidence base. and raises important questions about the quality of the evidence base. So then we have another question here from Manesh, which is about SHGs, collectives formed under some government schemes by external agencies, instead of from members within the community realising the importance of collectives, often disband once the agency establishes themselves and leaves and withdraws. What is the solution to this? And so I think we spoke about this a little bit, or we speak about this a little bit in terms of moderating factors in our paper. And can I invite you, Kata, to just talk to a little bit about this?
Yes, indeed. I think this reflects also our experience in our through the IIED, through IIED and the Forest and Farm facility that we engage in, where we support forest and farm producer organizations. And it's a key point, of course, where the motivation for grouping together comes from, and what support is then also provided externally. I suppose as a general recommendation in terms of future practice in supporting collective organizations is to really look at the local context in which the support is to be provided, and to conduct a thorough stakeholder analysis to see who are the interested groups out there, and what are the challenges they face, and try to offer targeted support for any collective action. Yeah, I think context specific is probably in one point of the summary.
Thanks very much, Kata. And so as we're running out of time, I'm just going to select one more question, and apologies, that means we're not going to get through some of them here, but there's this question here from Claire, where they say, curious to know if there was a study that showed the social communal impact of the women unable to pay the high loans obtained from the VSLAs during a shock or drought, such as a drought, and did the reliance on loans create a dependency aside from helping to diversify livelihoods? Two really interesting questions. Janine, are you happy to take these on?
Yeah, sorry, could you just repeat the question for me?
Of course I can. So the first one is, curious to know if there was any study that showed the social or communal impact of the women unable to pay high loans obtained from VCLSAs during a shock. And did reliance on loans create a dependency aside from helping to diversify livelihoods? So maybe if I could just chip in first, in terms of whether there was a creation of a reliance on loans as a dependency, we didn't see any reflection on that. I think that's a really important question to ask. We didn't see that reflected in the evidence base, and I think that's because it was broadly positive. There's this broadly, people are writing up very, very positive, and there might be a risk of bias there slightly. I think one thing that we do have to reflect on is that some of those people who were contributing to the evidence here are institutions that support collective action themselves. They're external institutions. So there's a little bit of a vested interest here in portraying positive impacts on resilience. And then in terms of whether people were unable to pay the high loans obtained from the VSLAs, actually what we found is that the VSLAs and different savings groups one of the benefits was that they were providing very flexible payment mechanisms, and that was the key benefit. And one thing that a couple of studies said is that this was great because what it did is reduce dependency upon any kind of loan sharks, and that was a really important benefit. So I think we didn't really see that, Claire. What we saw actually was this, again, in a very positive spin. I don't know, Janine, whether there's anything you want to add there.
No, I think I would just potentially say, I think it links back to some of the cautions that some of the authors raised about why there wasn't that direct connection. We did find that a lot of the studies tended to, at least it appeared, that they were focusing on very kind of short-term benefits of resilience. And when we were thinking about compounded or extended shocks or stresses, the studies didn't really go into detail about what the resilience impacts would be there. But if we see, for example, that a shock is affecting an entire community and people are drawing down on the collective savings pot, questions were raised by the authors about the sustainability of that finance. So if we move from one shock to another in a short period of time, will the women be as resilient to the second shock as they were to the first? So I think it does link in really well with some of the author cautions and some of our recommendations for future work.
Thanks, Janine. And one last thing, if I may, there is a question here about, were there any categories where risks and challenges overpowered resilience, women's resilience? Now, we didn't see that in the literature at the moment, but there were authors across the literature raising questions about with compounded shocks and stresses as they interact with each other, maybe we might start to see that playing out. Thanks so much for all these really interesting questions. If only we had more time to delve it in and actually have an exchange on this, that would be absolutely fantastic, given all the brains in the room. Really thank you for your attention, and I'll pass over to Benu at IRRI. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, everyone, all the presenters. I think the presentation was very insightful, and I want to thank all the audience members for those fantastic questions which brought out the nuances. And I'm still absorbing the wealth of knowledge, even though I've been engaged with the process all throughout. But I think when you listen to it like this, everything coming together and the culmination of this particular project, it is just amazing what has been achieved. And also, like Kata mentioned, in her in 2 slides that she had with evidence gaps and recommendations, there is a long way to go still. And so I think, I hope that this particular research does throw up all those very important research questions, research directions that we need to take to examine this interlinkage further and see what it can do for research as well as for women's collective action. With that, I'd just like to quickly announce that the working paper based on this particular study would be coming out in another month or a couple of months. We'll also have a blog which the IIED team has brought together, and an evidence explainer, which is basically 1.5 one-pager, which makes this entire very complex way of doing research very, very accessible. It makes it very accessible and can be read by anyone else. So those will come out in another month or 2, and I'd like all of you to look forward to that, and please let us know what you think. So with that, I think we'll close this. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us tonight. Thank you.